Because you've always taken such charge.
Llegó justo antes del aguacero.
You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.
Welcome to the Border Chronicle podcast. I'm Melissa Del Bosque, co-founder of the Border Chronicle, along with Todd Miller, where we cover the U.S.-Mexico border from a border perspective. And you can read and listen to more of our work at theborderchronicle.com. Today, I'm speaking with Andrea Flores, an attorney and immigration policy expert. She has served at the White House, the National Security Council, the Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Senate. She's also led national immigration policy teams at the ACLU, and she's originally from Las Cruces, New Mexico, so she's a fronteriza. And I'm so glad that you could join us today. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you. I don't know if you can hear my dog barking.
Yeah.
Yes. Apologies for that.
We can include your dog in the podcast.
Yes, my dog wanted to be part of the introduction. But thank you so much for hosting me on this podcast.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. So you've been involved in immigration policy making for a long time in both the Obama and the Biden administrations. And I'm so glad that you're here. So I've wanted to have this conversation to sort of, do a forensic autopsy of the Biden administration and immigration policy and what happened. So and you were there, of course, especially you were there the first year of the Biden administration. So when he took office in January of 2021, he inherited an immigration system that was basically like Swiss cheese. It had been hollowed out. And in a previous conversation on the podcast that we had with David Beer, who's immigration policy head for the Libertarian Cato Institute, he talked about how the Trump administration issued more than 500 policies during the first term to disrupt the immigration system's operations. And he added unfunded mandates and exclusions and requirements that had no basis in immigration law. At least 30 times during the first Trump administration, the courts found that Trump was enacting immigration policies illegally. But Beer said, the assault on the rule of law was so relentless that many of those changes weren't stopped. So he said the Biden administration did lead the immigration system out of an unprecedented calamity, is how he phrased it during our conversation, but that it often moved too slowly and lacked focus. And in reading your work, I know that was a frustration of yours as well. So I'm hoping that you could talk about your role in the early days of the Biden administration and what you and other staffers were facing as you tried to rebuild this immigration system and reinstate asylum. What was that like?
Absolutely. Well, it was very daunting for a number of reasons. And, for your listeners, I had served in one administration before when the politics of immigration were really different under President Obama, when there was still a bipartisan consensus of some sort that immigration reform was good for the country and benefited people. And really, with the rise of President Trump as such a restrictionist, using immigration as a political weapon against pretty much everyone at that point in 2015, we inherited something really different. And it was also coming out of an unprecedented global pandemic, right? Where borders had been closed along the region, migration was significantly down. And I remember the energy of 2020 and the way the public responded to so much of what Trump did on immigration. It really did feel as though we had political space to move confidently on this issue, right? And I joined the transition team with hope that we would be not just rebuilding and not just patching those Swiss cheese holes, but actually building something far better that maybe had never existed. But it became clear from the outset that every team is new. Every administration is a startup that has never worked together before. And the team that I joined was one that had not, most very distinguished senior officials who had not worked on immigration. And so those of us who were immigration experts, I think, had a number of different theories at a time when global migration itself was in a completely new moment, right? We've never seen displacement in the Western Hemisphere. I think it was like something like 30% of people in the Western Hemisphere were displaced by the time President Biden took office. So I will say there was some alignment at the start, right? Which was we wanted to rebuild the asylum system. We knew that the border politically was something that the president had to get right, or else it would cost him politically in other ways with other parts of his agenda. And we also knew that the public was actually very supportive of things like border closures for public health reasons, right? So, how do you rebuild asylum, keep the public on your side, manage migration trends? But really from the outset, it was clear that the White House was quite divided, even on what I just said, right? I thought we were kind of coming in with that vision. And then that vision from the transition team didn't really pass over into the White House. And there were factions. And unlike the Obama administration, there wasn't one senior advisor in charge of all of this. There were multiple. And we can get more into the details of this, but it was also very clear that the cultural transition at the Department of Homeland Security was an issue. So what the officers experienced under President Trump, many of them were very angry that President Biden had won. They were angry about what they perceived we were going to do before we even did it. And they were not initially acting with us on some of our goals at the border. So we can dive more in, but it was incredibly daunting. But I do think there is a political misperception, that we didn't prioritize the border right away, but that does not align with my experience. I think everyone was very focused. It was just disagreement about how to actually accomplish the goals.
Yeah, no, so I'm super curious about the agencies within DHS that were really upset that Biden had won. Was that like the Border Patrol and ICE? Because I know like Border Patrol union members had basically campaigned on behalf of Trump leading up to the election.
I think it's so interesting living through this present moment and thinking back to 2020 because when I would participate in Biden transition conversations, there was high awareness and desire to reform Border Patrol. And there was an understanding that they were being radicalized online, that some of them had ties to white nationalist groups. There was, we saw some of their actions in the city of Portland during the George Floyd protests and the way that they were treating U.S. citizens, all being mirrored today. And so there was a reform agenda we had anticipated. But once we got into office, there was such fear of upsetting them as an entity. And I was really struck by the difference in the Biden administration from the Obama administration of how much deference we paid to sort of frontline agency employees in setting policy. And so they were wanting to keep things like Title 42, even though the evidence of the very early weeks were that it was a policy that incentivized people to make more crossings and that smugglers were charging people more. And there were all of these consequences. But they were so fearful of losing that policy that they were doing things nobody asked them to, like releasing people en masse from custody, sending signals in border communities, doing street releases that they weren't supposed to be doing. And that triggered more movement to the border. And so I think that a next administration cannot ignore the need to reform and really look at the politicization of those agencies because not reforming CBP, we're living through those consequences today.
Yeah. I mean, with Border Patrol, one of the things that the Trump administration did during his first term was that they gave the Border Patrol union a lot more hours of union time. And, the Border Patrol union, they have their own podcast. They do a lot of content creation. And so that extra union time was spent really like stumping for Trump, right? And because the head of the union at the time, Brandon Judd, who's now, the ambassador to Chile, was, he had Trump on speed dial, basically. I mean, he was kind of during the first Trump administration, really calling the shots on border policy, I think, and really enjoyed that power. So like you said, they became very, very politicized, I think, during the first Trump administration. And now, of course, now we just see them running roughshod across the country, just doing whatever the hell they want. And then, of course, they also went after Alejandro Mayorkas very hard. And I know
That's
you've
right.
worked with him quite a bit. So, yeah, I'm just curious as to why they were afraid, though, to confront this.
Well, I think that let's go back to the administration as a startup in and of itself, and the
Yeah.
senior advisors at the White House level, they came from the national security community, which is really different than the culture at the Department of Homeland Security. And if you're in the State Department, you have a very organized workforce of civil servants, including, your foreign service officers. They're experts in the field. You do listen and prioritize their expertise. And I think there was a lack of understanding of DHS's history and culture, and lack of understanding that there is never, these agencies have never been professionalized like a
Yeah.
normal. I'm not saying a police department is the ideal, but like they have not been professionalized. These have been decades long issues. But I was always surprised, they're bringing in line border patrol officers into policy decisions at the White House level, highly unusual. And there were discrepancies, right, of information that we were getting. And I think that was a real fatal mistake in terms of the administration's ability to manage the border, and then also their reluctance to pursue policies that would have gotten the situation under control much faster. It kind of kept them overly focused on the line at the border, and it took them away from a lot of the newer ideas we had talked about in the transition of, you don't want to be dealing with migration only after people arrive. There are so many different ways to help displaced people before they even make that choice to migrate. And I think that's a far more humane way to think about in terms of migration management. But with the Border Patrol, they only see it as a line in the sand, right? And so that really informed our policies. And there were many times that had major consequences, right? Saying, well, there's nothing we can do about Haitians who are being pushed out of Chile and Brazil until they arrive. Well, that's absurd, right? And that led to major humanitarian problems at the border. And like I said, I'm going to keep talking about this because it's a lesson learned for future administrations. You can respect law enforcement without having them set your policy.
Yeah, or set the policy and set the narrative for the national narrative. I mean, it drove me insane during the Biden administration because Fox News was out there. The whole MAGA sort of information ecosystem was out there with all their content creators on the border 24/7, creating this invasion and crisis narrative and Biden open borders. And they really dominated the national narrative to the point where, if legacy or mainstream media came in, they would end up buying into that narrative because there was no counter narrative being put out there, that no, we're not under invasion. No, Democrats are not willingly letting people in so they can vote in the election. I mean, these were the kinds of conspiracy theories that were being spread. And I mean, we wrote about that quite extensively at Lighthouse Reports, where I also work, and the Border Chronicle, about this Border 911 group, which was Tom Homan's, dark money group, and Rodney Scott, who's now the head of CBP, was part of it. And they went from state to state, meeting with groups and telling them how we were under invasion and that, Biden was willfully destroying our democracy by allowing these illegal invaders into the country, in quotes.
You touched on my favorite topic, which is that for the last 10 years, Trump and his allies have invested in a national grassroots and also very successful media campaign to demonize immigrants, anyone connected to immigrants, and of course the entire borderlands, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think I saw this in real time, and I see it so clearly now, but we're 10 years behind in offering that counter narrative, and I really felt it in the Biden administration. And it's one of the reasons I had to step away because we were providing almost no context to American communities. And I understood why they were angry over the years, right? I think They didn't understand why people were being bused into their cities. They were asking for help. They weren't getting it. They didn't understand the Venezuelan migration crisis and that it had surpassed the size of the Syrian refugee crisis. And it was just shocking that an issue of such national import never got the bully pulpit of the White House to give the public context. And to your point, that allowed the really extreme right to fill in the gaps of what was happening. And they filled those gaps in, and they did it very effectively. And, the White House on a number of issues failed to communicate, but on this one, it was devastating and it helped fuel Trump's rise and it numbed people. And if you remember those weeks after the 2024 election when President Trump was reelected, and everyone said mass deportations it is. And there was a belief that they would be popular and a belief that cracking down would be popular. But that came because no one was offering any facts or alternatives from the Democratic side. And we're, once again, currently living those consequences. So that was a deeply frustrating element that you pointed out. And thank you for doing what you could to cover everything that was happening.
Yeah, I mean, if you live at the border, and you're from the border too, it's so evident when you're there in person. You can see the content being created. I mean, I walked into the Fox News mobile newsroom, in McAllen, and they were in there just creating content, and you could see how they would select certain shots. It's really funny. There's this particular park in Mission, Texas, called Anzaldúa Park, which is basically closed now and has been, highly militarized. It's basically like a headquarters for Texas DPS and National Guard. So Fox had its mobile newsroom in there. And on the other side in Mexico, there's an amusement park. And they have like the Pachamama cruise ship. They have all this stuff going on. And, Fox would angle its cameras away so you couldn't see the amusement park in Mexico. And it would just be on the like DPS gunboats. And, they take Republican congressional members out there so that, they could do this war zone fear-based narrative. And you could see, the kids are over there playing on the other side of the river. And none of that would be in the frame.
No, and it's why I'm here in DC. I growing up on the border, growing up during the Bush administration and the post 9/11 era, seeing how it became a national news story. I mean, it drove my college essay I wrote about how nobody understood the border. I remember applying to work for the Obama administration, saying I wanted to work on this. And it is a region in America that does not warrant the same sort of respect from Washington still, right? We don't treat it as at all an economic region, a place that families like mine and yours, right? That's our American identity, right? Being from those communities. And so I think it's made our policymaking worse and worse the further we've gotten from listening to border mayors, listening to border groups. That was a big problem as well during the Biden administration, was just not hearing them when they said, we're at capacity and we need you to take, new steps. That isn't a small town being hysterical about migration. That's what they're asking for, what they needed. And we would often ignore those calls. And I felt one reason, like I said, I had to step away from the administration is if I'm not doing right by the own community I came from, then I'm not doing right here in DC. So I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's still a big problem, the way we think about the border. Even now, people say the border's fine, it's quiet. Well, what is happening with every community along the border right now is once the border's quiet, we don't think about it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, it just killed me during the Biden administration. I remember talking to the mayor in Del Rio, and this is at the very beginning of the administration when, they were getting a lot of people arriving. And at the same time, our media ecosystem has completely fallen apart. And it's now very much dominated by this more of a MAGA ecosystem on social media and so forth, with like influencers and things like that. And I remember talking to the mayor, who had been talking like exclusively to Fox and these right-wing content creators. And so it was creating this crisis narrative. And he's like, these are the only people who are here. and I'm not getting anything from the administration. Nobody's talking to me. So he was incredibly frustrated. And I just feel like elected officials up and down the border were so frustrated with the administration. And, and then the whole right-wing MAGA ecosystem was there to capture that frustration and then to really create this fear-based narrative, and which they also monetized, and they sell merch, and they do, they financially benefit from it as well.
And I'm so glad you point that out, because so much of the Biden story is just the failure of basic good politics, right? You show up in the community that's impacted by the policies that you're either struggling with or being challenged by. And I get frustrated when I read what went wrong under Biden from just different media stories, and they make it seem as though there was this, sort of progressive wing that was pushing on bad outcomes and bad policies. And I said, go call these mayors on the border and ask, they were lifting up solutions, they were a stakeholder group, and ask why they weren't having their calls answered, right? I think that is such a critical part of learning going forward. You just can't ignore local communities there.
Yeah, I have to say, I was very disappointed in the way the Biden administration dealt with the border, but I was very, it was amazing how border communities responded to the issue, and I feel like border communities have been left on their own for so long now in dealing with these major issues, massive amounts of people on the move in the Western Hemisphere, like you said, this unprecedented number of people who are migrating, and other countries like Colombia are also receiving thousands and thousands of people from Venezuela. I mean, this was something that was happening all over Latin America as well. And I feel like border communities really rose to the challenge. They created rapid response teams. They housed people. They fed people, because they had to. I mean, here's everybody there seeking protection, needing help. And so the communities had to stand up. And I feel like they also are a good example of solutions, that the rest of the country could learn from, or Washington, right? If they only listen to border communities.
I'm so glad you mentioned this, because I think one of my beacons of hope under the Biden administration was the border shelter providers. I think the way that they adapted when the federal government wouldn't or said they could not was incredible. I think one of the most novel ideas that they did on their own is when New York and Chicago and Denver said, we're at capacity, like we need you to figure out a federally coordinated strategy. The White House said no. The border shelter providers started to bring on volunteers and staff to match newly arriving migrants with communities who wanted to host them and had jobs for them. That was, these groups and providers doing essentially a government function. And I never feel like they got the recognition and the appreciation that they deserved. And now they're being targeted by this administration for doing that work on behalf of the government. And so should Democrats govern again, I mean, really respecting those experts on the ground. And to your point, the innovations, the solutions that they moved on, I just try to lift those up all the time. I mean, I think if I can say one of my missions in Washington is just trying to be that bridge to say, look, I remember going to El Paso County at the very end and just seeing how they had adapted, right? And that was just one county. Because I know we haven't mentioned this yet, but Governor Abbott also had to sort of, in the worst way, had to take over a lot of these functions. And all of that came from just an absence of federal leadership on what is a federal issue. And that is what I hope a lot of Americans understand, that inaction really here was the problem.
Yeah, I think in the national thinking, the border is this place where all this tragedy occurs, and it's to the point where people don't even want to engage with it, right? But there are so many solutions, grassroots solutions, that have come from border communities, and it's actually a very positive story. And I think an important lesson for us to understand during this Trump administration, when, the government is increasingly weaponizing itself against us, that we're going to have to come up with grassroots, community-led solutions, which the border has been doing already for years.
That's right. There's so much learning that these groups facing deployments can just sort of gain from the border groups. But I agree. I don't think solutions on immigration reform right now are coming at the federal level. They're coming from cities experiencing now Border Patrol and ICE and other agencies on their doorstep. And they're innovating and figuring out ways to protect their neighbors because no one else is coming to help them.
It's very interesting to see these cities in the interior now getting this treatment that border communities have had for so long, the impunity of these border agents that Congress and elected officials have just been unwilling to rein in. They've just, like you said in the beginning, they've just never been professionalized. They don't have oversight or accountability like a city police department would have.
Yeah, I'm sure you feel the same way I do when you see some of their tactics and you say, oh, these vehicle chases or these car rammings or the use of lethal force when an item is thrown, right? Those are things that border communities have experienced for decades. And the racial profiling piece, I've been warning people. I said the second you have Border Patrol in these interior cities, they've been operating largely by racial profiling. The first time I was racially profiled by Border Patrol, I was 12 years old. And, it's been multiple times that I have been stopped and questioned going back home to southern New Mexico since. And that's just part of my experience. And so I tried to warn people last year, when that starts happening in cities, you will be stopped. You have to, do not assume your citizenship is protecting you once they spread these tactics to ICE, to Federal Bureau of Prison officers who are now doing immigration enforcement. Border Patrol's culture spreading. And I think I know you just had an amazing conversation with Jen Budd, but we should all be really afraid of that and understand that those tactics are not new, to your point.
Yeah. And I want to go back to when you first started with the Biden administration. What were you tasked with doing? And if you could talk a little bit about the conflict within the administration over how to handle the border or what to do.
Absolutely. So when I joined, we had a theory that asylum was going to have to be reformed and modernized. And that came from the 2014 border crisis, I'd call it, under President Obama. And I use border crisis because, for communities that were receiving people, it was a sense of crisis. I don't mean it in the Fox News, the border is out of control.
There was a big debate over using the word crisis, where President Obama didn't want to use that word, I remember. Yeah.
And sometimes I always think, what would someone back in my community use? They might use crisis. I think sometimes we overthink these terms at the political level, and I think if your community is running out of space, like that is going to feel like a crisis moment for you. And so I say, from the 2014 moment, though, we knew that asylum would likely have to be changed because in the history of asylum, I know you had, Jonathan Blitzer on to talk about his incredible book that really outlines the history of our asylum system. This idea of a land-based adjudication system that could function when there were more people at the border, we've never tried to build that to work well, right? We haven't tried to build an intake system that is orderly, that works with communities, that keeps migrants in safe places. And so it didn't exist. And you hear a lot, I think at the national level, people should come and seek asylum the right way. Well, they all are, right? As you know, if you cross the border, even illegally, then you can still apply for asylum as a defense to your deportation. So my mandate and assignment was, what if we do what we've never done, which is at official ports of entry, create a real intake process specifically for asylum seekers. Now, legally, you can come up to a port of entry, but for listeners not from the border, these are multi-vehicle lane, massive spaces, ton of security, not a place that you can maybe just walk up without any sort of admission documents and feel safe to present your claim. And there's also a long history of these people being turned away for trying to do and seek asylum that way. So my assignment was to what would that process look like? And so we were still mid-pandemic and we worked with UN organizations, we worked with the government in Mexico to start with the defined population. And it was those who had been sent back to Mexico under the Remain in Mexico program to await their asylum hearings in the United States. And so we knew we had 68,000 people. We wanted to bring them in, and we wanted to pilot doing so at ports of entry in collaboration with border communities. And we did build that process, and we did start bringing people in that way, and we worked with border groups and mayors. And it's a process actually you don't hear about because it wasn't a problem, right? It was something that I remember the mayors telling me they really appreciated because they could say, I know you wanted to, bring in 100 people today. Could you just make it slightly less and then we'll increase next week, right? Mm-hmm. It was a very responsive process to community need. Now, the tension was that we were trying to create something new. At the same time, many people didn't have another option to cross, so they were crossing in between the ports, which was a big concern for the White House. And that was in tension with this process I was creating. And so over time, I would say we're making progress, right? The people really like this. Even DHS liked this. We called it the MPP wind down. But backlash started to grow, and they said, well, why are you letting those people in when we're trying to keep everyone out? And that became an issue. And then the White House started to look again at restarting Remain in Mexico, believing that that was the only way they could get the number of people arriving under control, even though, and having run the process I was running, I knew that at least a third of the people who had been sent to Remain in Mexico were already in the country. They had already crossed again, right? These are not, deterrence is a often very inefficient policy. And so that was what I did the entire time until a court blocked it. When a group affiliated with Stephen Miller sued the end of the Remain in Mexico program, and so the White House shut down the wind down. And so we just stopped. We stopped the work of asylum reform that first year. We kind of gave up on it, and that is a real loss for this country because we could have been figuring out how to make the border more orderly in many ways, but then the entire focus became how do you just keep everyone out? And that focus did not work, right? You saw record numbers of people still crossing when that was the entire priority of the White House.
Right. And to have the space, the time, and the funding to actually build a better system, you really need a bipartisan agreement, right? Like you need these Republican states like Texas, which is basically an extension of Stephen Miller's legal team, was constantly filing lawsuits. Anything that Biden tried to do to reform, lawsuit would be filed by Republican states and it would be stopped.
That's exactly right.
So it just seems like an incredible job it's going to be at this point, in America, to get these two sides together and to create this space where we can rebuild something better for the 21st century.
I agree. I mean, when I left the White House, I went straight to the Senate because I wanted to build support for a modern asylum system and see if we can move some other immigration priorities alongside it, because there were both sides wanting to do asylum reform. The problem ended up being the administration not wanting to call what was happening a crisis. They did not want to be seen as asking for help for Congress because that would acknowledge that it was a crisis, right? In the hope of making the story go away, there were multiple opportunities that I worked on with small bipartisan groups to have moved legislation. And so I found it very frustrating when at the right, going into an election, they said all of a sudden we need to do a Senate border bill. And for many of us, we had been trying to push them to do something far better than what they ended up doing, but really acknowledging to the American people, we need to reform this part of the system. We need to do broader reform, but at least this part is something that there was alignment on fixing. So I share that because I think people believe that it took Biden so long to act because maybe Congress wasn't with him. They were trying. And then when he finally stepped in, there was no incentive, right? Because President Trump was the nominee, becoming the nominee again, and immigration was his number one issue. So of course he was going to block it at that point. The time to do it was earlier. Now, I think this moment, I think, we've experienced incredible loss in the immigration reform movement after the 2024 election, but I'm not hopeless only because, you can't be, or else we got to pack up our bags now. We can't give up on Congress. And I'm going to keep saying that because that's our only way forward to, I we've relied too much on the White House each time there's a Democrat in office doing what they can to fix things. We have
Yeah.
to build the political support for a modern system.
Yeah, and what were the tensions like within the White House? Like who was advocating like let's just not talk about the border? Uh
Yeah, I mean, it felt like for me, I was at the White House, so I can't speak to really what DHS leadership was saying, but at the White House level, everyone, right? There was recommendation, and I was part of this recommendation to have the president do a border speech early, right, in the spring, and say, this is what's happening, this is what we're trying, this is what we need. They canceled that speech. They ended up sending the vice president down to the border with, I think, without an appropriate sort of strategy, because they had spent over a month saying her job was not to do the border, and then they sent her down to the border, right? That was highly confusing.
yeah.
And I continue to lay responsibility amongst sort of just the president's highest team because that was a comms failure at the outset. And to this day, people tell me Biden opened the border. He pursued many. He was not doing enforcement. I'm like, he expelled 1 million people that first year around. And so, of course, he was enforcing the law, but you don't know it, and you don't know
Right.
why that happened. And unfortunately, Democrats have a very hard task now of filling in some of those facts to the public who I don't know what the latest numbers will be now after the murder of Renee Good, but at least at the end of last year, you still see higher trust for Republicans on the issue of immigration. And I think some of that was just a White House that wasn't being honest with people about what they were experiencing and not sharing with them what they were trying to do.
And why is that? Like what is their fear? Because MAGA has been very successful at building this fear-based narrative, which has really helped them and helped Trump get elected. Why won't Democrats come up with a counter narrative?
This has been a question of my career. And I worked the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2015. And when President Trump, then just Donald Trump, did his first speech, and his first speech was about immigration. And I remember going to my team and saying immigration is going to be a major issue he runs on. And it was sort of treated as a joke, right? That he was funny, and they thought, oh, he's just claiming things about Mexicans. And I said, this is not a joke, right? This is a historical argument used at different times in US history to gain power for very authoritarian leaders. It's happening in Europe over and over again. They use immigration. I'm like, now it's our turn. And now we have to have some serious conversations. But even then, if you look at the Clinton campaign, where we landed was taking what President Obama had done and like moving it like a little bit to the left, right? Like that was the vision. But that assumes two things. It means that any American was following what President Obama had done, and two, that they wanted to go a little bit to the left of what he had done. And so already right there, you're lacking vision, and you're lacking any sort of argument for Americans to understand this is why we have an immigration system. This is how we benefit from it. This is why we're lucky immigrants want to come here. And this is why our system's broken for now, but how we want to fix it. Right? We needed that back then, and we needed clear leadership in calling out all of the lies that President Trump started using and that now have just become policy, right? This idea of, to me, one of the culminations of all the lies happened when he sent the over 280 men to CICOT in El Salvador. And I call that moment, right, because the silence around that moment from Democrats was really deafening. And when they were asked about it, they said, well, we shouldn't focus on these gang members. Like, right, like all of the lies turned into policy, and it turned into how the party is dealing with the issue now. And so I think a desire for the issue to go away, a misunderstanding that if you don't say anything, others fill in what your agenda is for you. And I think a lack of, I'll just say for me, as an immigration expert, it's I understand why Democrats would prefer to talk about healthcare and affordability, and they should do those things. But that doesn't mean you can ignore immigration because it's an issue of our time, and it will just get harder with climate change and the way people move and social media and AI. It's not getting easier for us, and ignoring it and not leveraging expertise is a major problem.
Yeah, and like you said, it's a well-worn authoritarian playbook. It's been used time and time again in our history in the U.S., and it's being used in Europe right now in places like Hungary. It's very obvious what they're doing, and it's just wild to me that, like you said, they're like 10 years behind in coming up with a counter narrative and sort of building out a policy platform to reform things. I want to say, so there's another thing that just drives me crazy. So for years, Democrats and Republicans have been trapped in the same narrative where Democrats are like, we need comprehensive immigration reform, and Republicans say, well, we need to secure the border first. So this has been happening now for years and years and years, and more than a third of the border is now under military control. Texas has spent tens of billions of Texas state, taxpayer money on sending soldiers and police and everything to the border. The federal government has spent billions at the border. And just last week, Senator John Cornyn, who's been a senator in Texas for a long time, comes out and says, oh, no, we can't do any comprehensive immigration reform. We have to secure the border first. He's been saying that same thing for like 20 years. And so Democrats always cave. They're like, okay, when they're in the White House, they're like, okay, we're going to put billions into the enforcement, apparatus. And then those Republicans are going to come around and they're going to do that, we're going to do a bipartisan immigration reform. And always, it's like Wile E. Coyote. The Republicans are like, oh, nope, we got to secure the border first. And it's like, how do we get out of this dead end? I don't know if I can take another year of hearing that we need to secure the border.
Yeah, it's been a deep frustration. I've written about this a bit, but the comprehensive immigration reform play is done, right? This idea of border security for legalization, no one's showing up for that anymore. And what I mean by that is Republicans don't need to show up for that anymore. And a lot of the work I'm doing right now, because look, I've been a Democratic staffer for most of my career. And so I've played a part in pursuing the strategy that it didn't work. And so I want to play a part in introducing strategies that could work and experiment, because we can't go back to exactly what you said. The border will never be secure enough for this current formation of the party. And I want to say what I think often that is really about, right? Which is that our economy has always had a large non-citizen workforce since chattel slavery, right? We had slavery, we replaced it with Chinese labor, and then we tried to exclude them. When we excluded Asian and Indian immigrants and kind of this whole group in the 20s, then we let in Mexicans, and then we tried to mass deport them in the 50s. So our entire history is, how do we preserve, though, a large non-citizen workforce? And I think oftentimes it's easier for Republicans to point and say, let's secure the border, than to really push them and say, what's stopping you from legalizing our non-citizen workforce, making sure that there's parity with American workers, and why aren't we moving into this sort of modern era of we should have people with legal status working. And I think because there's benefits that people have from that non-citizen workforce, right? For a lot of people, the immigration system isn't broken. And that's a big problem. And you have to change those incentives, and you have to call out some of those realities in this very populist moment we're in a moment where there is a large focus on the American worker, and remind everyone that we have the largest undocumented population in the world, and we're over here fighting when there's, border crossings are purportedly the lowest they've ever been. And they can still talk about the border. So I'm really interested in Democrats who are really flipping the issue and saying, why don't you want North Dakota to have enough nurses? I'm interested in that, right? Why don't you want the dairy industry to have a fully legal workforce when over 50% of it is undocumented? I think calling out what they're preserving is something we haven't been as aggressive on. And these are just some of the things I'm trying to work and organize around. But I agree with you. If we go back to here's enforcement for legalization, we lose immediately because what we built is what is happening in Minneapolis right now. That's what comprehensive immigration reform ultimately has resulted in, is these extremely well-funded, militarized, paramilitary agencies that are now in our communities. And those are the dots we have to connect for the public now to understand that those accusations that we didn't secure the border, well, I will see, the Biden era complicated that, right? Because there are people who have legitimate concerns about what happened under Biden, but that's separate and apart from the fact that these are now like some of the biggest law enforcement agencies really in the world that are in our cities now. And it's because of this secure the border versus other reforms.
Yeah, I mean, the funding that ICE and Border Patrol have been given under Trump's budget bill are bigger than many military departments in foreign countries.
That's right.
And there are some Democrats that are right now negotiating to give them more money. And that's the thing that we write about the Border Chronicle too, is that Democrats have paid into the system just as much as the Republicans by, like how you said, being caught up in this rhetorical circle of like, we'll just keep pouring money into this deportation system.
Yeah.
While Republicans keep, hitting us over the head with a cudgel and saying we need to secure the border more.
Yeah. And it really, I'll just say it culminated in that Senate border bill that President Biden tried to pass. And when I say culminated, they just it was essentially a massive suspension of the asylum system for nothing traditionally the Democrats had ever asked for. And so I just challenge people who think we have to lead solely with securing the border with what are we getting from that? Like, we're not getting any of our other priorities. I think about bills that Democrats have been introducing the DREAM Act. Why are we not even demanding the DREAM Act in exchange for things like almost suspending the asylum system in its entirety? And President Biden did not, and that also upended the politics of this issue. It showed that there were no longer that we didn't have our North Star goals. And this midterm year will be interesting to see what affirmative visionary ideas Democrats bring on this, because the other thing I'm very fearful of is that we just respond again to Trump's frame and we argue whether he has arrested that many people with criminal convictions or not, or if they are a threat to public safety or not. Like, we won't win. That was what was so hard under Biden in that first year. We thought we had the public with us, but we offered them nothing in terms of vision or explanation of what we were trying to build. And I fear that could happen again if we just oppose everything President Trump is doing, as we should, because it's very, very wrong. But then what are we moving towards?
Yeah. So you've created a Substack called America's Promise to create a forum to create this dialogue and thinking about how to modernize the immigration system and to tackle these things that we're discussing right now, these problems around like policy and narrative. How has that been going so far? You've had America's Promise, I think, for about 4 or 5 months. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. And it's part of me. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
And I want to ask, are there some elected officials out there, Democrats, that you see are pushing the needle forward and doing some good messaging and thinking around modernizing and fixing this immigration system? Because, I mean, basically at the end of this administration, we probably will not have an immigration system anymore. So right. The only way is up, if you want to look at it from a positive point of view.
That is. That's right. And yes, so I mean, inspired in part by your amazing work, I wanted to join the Substack community and have a Substack that focused for people wanting to understand why we haven't done immigration reform, why Washington has failed. And each piece I really try and include, lessons learned from my own policy experiences that I've witnessed, in history that people don't know. I think a lot about people don't know the history of ICE and how it evolved, and I think that's important right now. And then also ideas for the future, like throwing things out and introducing new ways to tackle this issue. And my hope for the platform is that people feel better equipped to judge and expect more from their elected officials than just saying, I promise immigration reform. Well, we're going on decades long of that promise, right? Get more specific, offer something, connect it to how it's going to help people, especially American citizens, right? Because when you leave out the American citizen from the immigration argument, you too often make it inadvertently an us versus them issue. It's not, right? Immigrants are of our community, they are in our community, and when the system works well for them, it works well for Americans, and really highlighting those benefits. And so some Democrats who are doing some exciting things, I really appreciate Congressman Gabe Vasquez. He wrote a guest post, and what I really like about how some of his thinking is he's looking at the question of legalizing differently. And what he has done is he's introduced a bill to help legalize workers already here in critical industries. That's already fresh. That's already new. He's identifying, healthcare, agriculture, and looking at caregiving. We need that, right? We need to maintain people that employers have trained and that we've welcomed already and that we know. I think that's a new way to think of legalization than creating one big anonymous path to citizenship. So that's already, very tailored. I talk about Senate candidate, and I don't endorse any candidates on this Substack, but, James Tallarico doing a debate and saying immigrants make us stronger and richer. That was such a clear, values-based and factual argument I haven't heard from Democrats in a long time. It was unapologetic. It was true. And he explained why immigration has been our secret, prosperous weapon as a country. And I'm going to keep shining light on leaders who I think are trying to move us in a new direction, because what we have tried has not worked. And I want America's Promise to feel like a hopeful space, and to also capture moments where we could choose to act differently, right? And I said, there's a post I think was most important to me where I just say our outrage is not enough anymore. And we've been outraged. I mean, I've been outraged for my whole career. I know that you have had outrage, and we have to get Congress to eventually act. And that's the only end to our outrage, and that sounds impossible, I know, but I'm trying to build up some hope for that in the moment, right? We have midterms. I think, look, you look at primaries, we have moderate congressmen now. Dan Goldman in New York, he wants to win his primary. He introduced a bill to end qualified immunity for ICE. If you had asked me a month ago, would that happen? Probably not. But I think the midterm year provides a way for those of us not just to go to protests, but then to find the candidate who's going to offer new things and offer the reforms, and then hold them accountable for pushing them. I get very excited in election years, right? Because they are these truly democratic moments, and midterm years in particular.
Yeah, I'm really happy. I'm happy to hear your enthusiasm and energy going into this, because we definitely need more of that. I just think the immigration system is complex, and it's so hard in the modern information space right now, where everything is, a couple of seconds on TikTok, or every piece of video is parsed down to a certain, short snip. So it's hard. Because everything is sliced and diced to create that, that system, that narrative, right, where people get it and they understand that, that immigrants do make our country stronger. I mean, we're all immigrants, obviously,
That's right.
unless you're Native American. So, yeah. So anyways, I really appreciate your enthusiasm and your experience in the trenches. I worked in the Texas Senate for 5 years, so I know. For a senator that represents Hidalgo County and the Rio Grande Valley, so I know how that feels, being in those discussions, and can be quite frustrating.
It can wear on you, and I think that's why I'm just trying new things and trying new ways to reach people, and I'll show up on every platform I can if I can get people excited about supporting leaders with immigration vision and ideas.
Yeah, well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Border Chronicle podcast. I really appreciate it. And everybody, join Andrea's Substack. It's America's Promise. and help her build a narrative, help her help the Democrats.
Thank you. Yes, it's true. I'm trying to help them do the best things because if
They need a
Democrats are
lot of
strong,
help.
yeah, if they are strong, we have a better chance at a better immigration system. So
They also need to listen to the border.
I agree, and I will keep saying that piece
Yes.
always.
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
So thank
All
you.
right.
This is a great conversation. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. That was Andrea Flores, a longtime immigration policy strategist in both the Obama and Biden White Houses, and you can read more of her work on her Substack, America's Promise. And that does it for this episode. This episode was edited by Jose Olivares, and if you like what you're hearing, please consider rating us on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more people find our show. You can check out more of our work at theborderchronicle.com. I'm Melissa Del Bosque, and this is the Border Chronicle podcast. Until next time.
Because you've always taken such charge.
Llegó justo antes del aguacero.
You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.